This day is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. You chose to hit play on this podcast today. Smart choice. Make another smart choice with Auto Quote Explorer to compare rates from multiple car insurance companies all at once. Try it at progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and affiliates, not available in all states or situations. Prices vary based on how you buy. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. This day, February 4th, 1968, a recovery effort is underway to find and get back the U.S.S. Pueblo, a U.S. military cargo and research vessel that was attacked and captured by North Korea a few days earlier. The Pueblo had 83 crew members. One of them was killed in the initial incident, and then the rest were taken capture, and over the next 11 months, the crew were held as POWs by North Korea, tortured, an international incident, international tensions growing and growing and growing. Obviously, we're talking about 1968 here, the Vietnam War and the escalating Cold War. To have a U.S. ship captured, its crew tortured, it's not great. It's not great. But I should mention one more thing. I said that the U.S.S. Pueblo was a military cargo and research vessel. It was that, but it was also a spy ship. It was a spy ship. And to this day, there are questions and murkiness about whether it had actually entered North Korean waters and precipitated this incident. But let's talk about the capture of the Pueblo and some of that early 1968 geopolitical context. Here, as always, Nicole Hammer of Vanderbilt and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
So I want to talk about the sort of TikTok of how this capture goes down, the POWs get taken, the reaction at home, the aftermath. But I think we should give a little background on the ship itself and some geopolitical context. So you ready for me to basically sum up the state of the world in 1968 in 90 seconds? Easy.
Let's do it.
Okay. No,
I got the clock going.
But look, we have this ship. The U.S.S. Pueblo is originally a World War II ship. It was launched in 1944 as a cargo vessel. It's repurposed in 67 basically as a spy ship, and it's given all sorts of stuff for signals intelligence and equipment. There's this larger context that the U.S. in the Cold War is looking for these smaller, flexible surveillance vehicles to basically go out there and see what the Soviet Union and North Korea are up to. So these cargo ships are the ones that kind of get repurposed in this way. Let's talk about early 1968. I mean, it is, tensions are very high. The Vietnam War, not going so great. This is just days before the Tet Offensive in Vietnam, right after a North Korean assassination attempt on South Korea's president, which, I don't know how much we remember that, given that Tet went down a couple days later.
That's the United States job to assassinate those guys? Come on.
So, things are just sort of popping off and hostilities are growing everywhere. And, the U.S., I think, in a sense, thinks, well, this is kind of the perfect time to do a little bit of snooping and spying because there is just so many other tensions going around. I don't know if that's the right calculus, but they start to send these ships out there to do this kind of surveillance.
Seems like a miscalculation, given everything that happens next.
So, okay, so the ship leaves Japan in January 11th, 1968. One of the storylines here is that as much as I talked about, it's been repurposed. This is the sort of leading edge of U.S. surveillance or these kinds of ships with this kind of equipment, this kind of crew. It is, by all accounts, under-equipped. The crew is not really a surveillance crew. They are mostly cargo ship guys. And so they don't really have a bunch of training in this stuff. They don't really have great defensive capabilities. Their machine guns don't really work. And more importantly, and this will come into play later, they don't really have equipment for destroying classified information, which is a key thing for these kinds of vessels. That will play in later. But anyway.
Can't just throw it in the water.
There you go. Exactly. That's a good thought. I'm sure someone had that thought.
Just dump it.
Yeah. That's like that apocryphal story about NASA developing a pen for billions of dollars and it to go into space, and then the Russians just used a pencil. It's like this. The U.S. military develops an incredibly complicated thing to incinerate classified materials, and someone else just throws it in the water. But anyway, okay, so did I do it? There you go. There's your geopolitical
Yes.
context. There's the U.S.S. Pueblo leaving Japan January 1968. How does it start to get into trouble?
So the first part of it goes pretty well. They leave to head over to the Pacific. They spend, like a week and a half bopping around. And the whole deal was the U.S. felt that if the boat stayed out of Korean waters, that there shouldn't be any problems. On January 23rd, there is some debate about to what extent this boat was in Korean waters, but North Korean vessels approached the Pueblo. And the Pueblo puts up its little flag. It's like, hey, we're Americans. It's fine. Also, look at these two oceanographers we have, and they're collecting samples. Totally normal science boat. Pay no attention. And the North Koreans respond by shooting. And they demand that the Pueblo stands down. And then the North Korean Air Force sends out some planes as backup. Now, you might expect that a gunfight would ensue, except the Pueblo, as Jody, you were saying, like these weren't well-trained boat people. And so the ammunition is down below decks. And I think so are the guns. Like the guns weren't
I think, were
set up.
covered in cold weather tarps. And so it would have taken like 10 minutes to uncover get the guns in place, find the ammo. Yeah. But, they're just simple oceanographers. What do you expect?
How would they know how to use guns? And so they realized pretty quickly, the crew on board, this is not going to go well. So they crank up the incinerators and start shoving in as much paper as they possibly can in order to try to destroy the sensitive materials. But, there are cannons firing at them and machine guns, and they're only able to incinerate so much before the North Korean army is there and taking them captive, and also taking their cryptographic machinery, which they would then use to decode 100,000 classified messages.
Yeah.
Now, the U.S. also has airplanes and could have launched them in order to protect the Pueblo, but ultimately don't. I think there's some argument that maybe the only airplanes around had nukes instead of conventional bombs, and the U.S. was not ready to launch a nuclear war.
A little too heavy-handed.
A little much. They were like, this doesn't seem like the best idea.
Yeah.
Anyway, and so the Pueblo is boarded, and the crew are taken, and as you said in the introduction, are then subjected to a significant amount of torture in the months that followed.
So one person, a fireman named Dwayne Hodges, is killed, and then, the ship is boarded, and the crew members, there's some real darkness to the story. The crew members are immediately blindfolded, their arms are tied behind their backs, they're beaten, they're taken into custody. And then it kicks off, no surprise, a major incident that actually lasts for 11 months, but kind of how does this all start to play out?
Yeah, it doesn't take too long, about several days, 5 days at the most, to find out that the Pueblo's been captured, that there are 83 hostages aboard this ship. And the president is sort of at an impasse because he absolutely wants to get the hostages back, but knows that it's not going to be easy feat to do so. People are giving him all kinds of advice about what he should do. There's one congressman that's like, you should just threaten to nuke them. And it's like, no, I don't think that's going to work. Johnson is not necessarily interested in retaliation because he doesn't want the hostages to get killed. He knows that will look bad, and especially for the family members who are terrified that their loved ones will not survive this. But it's delicate. It's really delicate. And it's also delicate because it shows the United States in this vulnerable place, and people want to see a show of force. They want to see we don't bow down and we're not chicken. And, there's all of this criticism that's coming in. And, the North Koreans are very clear almost from the jump. They're like, listen, this is what we want from you. We want you to admit that you were wrong. We want you to apologize for it. And we want you to promise that it will never happen again. And we are not negotiating. These are the terms. That's it. And you get nothing else. And so for months and months, they tried to negotiate. And it takes about 11 months. But the North Koreans got everything they wanted. The United States basically had to do all of what they call, the 3 A's. Admit wrongdoing, assure it would never happen again, apologize for it. And the hostages eventually get
I got to use the
released.
3 A's with my daughter sometime.
Honestly, I read those and I was like, okay, that's actually kind of good.
Yeah. But
Apologize, admit wrong, assure us you're not going to do it again.
Yes.
but in this moment, just to underscore the pressure that obviously Johnson is under, but we're talking about this goes down and then 5 days, 6 days later, the Tet Offensive, talk about everything everywhere all at once. Johnson is really not interested in escalating on a number of fronts, and is, more of a just trying to put out fiascos on a number of fronts.
Have you ever had the urge to sneak behind the cordoned off areas of a museum? Or roam the halls after closing time? The Smithsonian's flagship podcast, Side Door, will sneak you behind the scenes of the world's largest museum and research complex. Come learn about the ghosts that supposedly walk the museum halls after dark, how a train robbery gave rise to criminal forensics, why leeches are actually the coolest thing ever, and how to get away with murder in the Arctic. Maybe. You'll discover stories of history, science, art, and culture you won't find in a display case. You can listen to Side Door wherever you get your podcasts, or find us online at si.edu/sidedoor.
This day is brought to you by Quince. Now, who doesn't love the good things in life? And even though I enjoy a little luxury, it doesn't mean I can always afford it. But Quince is here to help. Quince has become my go-to for luxury essentials at affordable prices. I know we're all shivering right now, but I'm already thinking about spring and summer and refreshing my wardrobe a bit. So I'm on the Quince website right now looking at some stuff. Oh, another pair of linen pants. I have a pair of those already, but maybe a different color. There's sunglasses here I'm looking at. An organic cotton silk button-down polo sweater. If you see me rocking that this spring, please compliment it. It's very nice looking. And the best part of it all is that Quince items are priced 50 to 80% less than similar brands. You can get 100% Mongolian cashmere sweaters for $50, shorts, t-shirts. You can even get 14-karat gold jewelry. So now's the time. Treat yourself, restock, look good, give yourself the luxury you deserve with Quince. Go to quince.com/thisday for free shipping on your order and 365-day returns. That's QUINCE.com/thisday to get free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/thisday.
This is something we talk a lot about when we talk about the 1970s, especially the Iran hostage crisis, that the U.S., it feels like it doesn't have any control over world events.
Right. Yeah.
But here in this moment, you're getting the birth, in some ways, of the 1970s. You're getting this Pueblo incident that the U.S. has no leverage to wrestle back these hostages. You have the Tet Offensive, which is the first real signal that breaks through to the American public that despite all of the assurances that the U.S. is about to win this war, the U.S. is not about to win this war.
Yeah.
And this sense that this U.S. behemoth, this American superpower, actually doesn't have the power to bend the world to its will. And it is kind of this moment of breaking of American confidence that had built up over the 1940s and 50s and 60s.
It's very well put. And, obviously, this is related to what's happening in Vietnam and the larger geopolitical Cold War game that the U.S. is playing. But it's also a reminder, just to underscore what you're saying, Niki, that self-owns and sort of excursions, they aren't just follies on their own, but they also degrade your ability to respond to other things, right?
Yes.
And so, it's all connected. The USSR plays an interesting role here because, as much as, they're aligned with North Korea, and as much as the U.S. is kind of doing this as part of the larger geopolitical showdown with the USSR, they're kind of a little caught off guard by this, and they're kind of telling the North Koreans, hey, what are you up to? Don't go off, don't go crazy here.
Yeah.
And so they're playing an interesting role, and there's some back channeling through the USSR actually to North Korea throughout all of this. But as you were saying, Kellie, it goes on and on for 11 months. There is some interesting wrinkles here in that certainly the POWs were tortured. One thing that leads to even more torture is that they're sending photos back, proof of life photos back to the United States. And, Americans are seeing these images. At first, the North Koreans don't realize this, but the Americans are a lot of them are giving the middle finger, flipping the bird in some of those photos. And the North Koreans don't know that, just they don't know what that means. But then they eventually figure that out. And then,
they said it was a good luck sign.
Yeah, exactly.
Right?
We're saying good luck. And they're like, wait a second.
Yeah.
I mean, you got to admire that.
You gotta admire that,
they
flipping of the
knew
bird,
that they were already in a pretty tough situation, and yet they were showing defiance in that moment, which
Yeah.
I don't know that I would do it.
There were tortures, beating, psychological torture, forced confessions, a mock firing squad at one point. I mean, it is really, really rough. And, in these negotiations, you read some of the accounts of these negotiations, they're really interesting, too. I mean, yes, just like the North Korean style of negotiation was perhaps as you would expect, but very, very, very hard line. There were reports that, American negotiators would go in there and have this idea that, like, okay, we're just going to sit across from the negotiators and we're going to talk and then we're going to figure this out, and they're empowered to do so. And they quickly realized, like, no, these negotiators are not empowered to do anything. There's only one sort of level that's making the decisions, and that's not in this room. And they literally talked about how the North Koreans had like note cards in front of them that were like, if the Americans say this, then you respond this. If the Americans say this, and so like the Americans would say something, the North Koreans would like flip through their note cards to see what the response is and just either be like, no, or we're not authorized, but just an interesting dynamic there that goes on for months and months and months. So eventually, though, December 1968, the crew is released. It's exactly 11 months after capture. Anything else about the kind of way this winds down?
I mean, one thing to me that just sort of sat with me is the idea that all of the survivors, the hostages, are adamant that they're like, we never entered their territory. We never entered into North Korean waters. That this was more of an attack than it was us getting caught with our hand in the cookie jar kind of thing. And that's interesting, too, this idea that, they were ambushed outside of North Korean waters.
One other wrinkle here is that we talked about the 3 A's, the admit, apologize, and assure it won't happen again. The U.S. also issues a statement. The chief negotiator, General Gilbert Woodward, issues a statement, and then the statement kind of makes clear that they had just done this in order to secure the release of the crew. Like, it was very important to carefully word this statement to be about securing the release of the hostages and not about admitting the wrongdoing, at least, domestically. And apparently that idea and that line and that kind of like, you can issue a statement that parses it in this way was suggested by one of the wives of the task force back in Washington, saying like, there's an angle
shocking
here for
that the men didn't know how to apologize.
Yeah, exactly.
The other sort of like long tail of this incident is, the crew members were returned to the United States, but the ship was not. The U.S.S. Pueblo remained under the control of the North Koreans, where in fact it is still to this day. And back in 2013, they like gussied it up and they turned it into a museum in order to show the incident from the North Korean perspective. So, you get this video, it shows the apology. The narrator says the U.S. imperialists went down on their knees again before the independent army and people of North Korea and signed the instrument of surrender, which, North Korea is not a free and democratic state, but
yeah, I know.
But
at the same time, if you think about it, I mean, for PR, that's like a great PR propaganda stunt.
And even during the Obama era, when I think tensions with North Korea flared a little bit again, there was talk about the Pueblo being one of these kind of foundational incidents that I think sent a message to the North Koreans, or at least let the North Koreans tell themselves, like, oh, we can go toe-to-toe with the U.S. and they will back down. They will be restrained. And so, the resonance here continues. I want to end on something, Niki, you kind of brought up a little bit, but which is just like incidents like these and how they play into the sort of historical memory. I mean, I don't think people are walking around saying, oh yeah, 1968, I think of the U.S.S. Pueblo. Though Johnson, in his memoirs, said, if there was one day for me that symbolized the chaos of 1968, it was the morning I woke up and found out the Pueblo had been captured. So Johnson certainly dropped a pin on that day.
In all of 68? I mean, a lot happened in
exactly.
68.
So that's the kind of thing I'm trying to think through is we write these stories of these eras. And obviously there's only so much room in the historical memory to kind of put in specific incidences. But of course, when we think about 68 and 69, we mostly think about the Vietnam War and U.S. excursions and the protests at home and the assassinations and the draft.
RFK's assassination.
Exactly. And so, like, I don't know. It's just a reminder that, like, there are all these other incidences that just put one little, like, straw on the camel's back of the historical tides.
This would not make my top 5. Do you know what I mean? Like, top 5 of 1968.
But at the time, I think, you have to understand that it really contributed, right? It did contribute. It wasn't like, oh, there's this random incident, look at all these other things. Like, it really did capture. And so I don't know, I'm just been thinking through a lot about how, like, every little every little moment and every little incident does add up to this kind of big sweeping historical memory.
I think that's especially interesting in this case because we tend to teach, if we're teaching about 1968, the Tet Offensive on January 31st is this turning point in the war. It is this turning point in Americans' understanding of the country's power. I don't teach about the Pueblo incident, but it was the precondition. It
softened the ground
to that response. And I think the strength of the public reaction to the Tet Offensive can't be understood outside of the Pueblo incident just happening.
Yeah.
So now we're going to have to change our syllabus.
I'm just saying.
It all ties together.
Consider it. Or at least assign this episode.
Yeah, just tell people to listen to the podcast.
Yes.
All right. Well, I'm really glad we got to that. It's been on our list for a while. Super fascinating. Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you as always.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
Radiotopia.